Well, g'day Year 9s and welcome back to Home Learning. Look, I totally realise that many of you are probably super stressed out by the fact that we're back at home once again doing this over the internet. But what I want you to remember is how well you handled this the first time round. I was absolutely blown away. You were by far my best class when it came to having your work submitted on time, the quality of work, and so forth. You did an amazing job. So, as I discussed in the video that you would have seen already, we're not really going to change much about our system, but we're just going to plow ahead and keep going. Now, one thing that I want to make you aware of is the fact that normally we would do this topic, which is ecosystems, by the way. We're doing that for the entire term in term 4, and we would do chemistry in this term, but for very obvious reasons I can't have you guys blowing things up at home, etc. So we're going to do chemistry in term 4 and ecosystem in term 3, which I think is a much cleverer idea. Alright, and with that being said, I think we'll just plow straight into it. Alright, so here we go. Alright, now as we often do with a new topic, we're going to start with a bunch of new definitions. Some of these you will have heard of already, some of them you will know the definition for, but perhaps in a non-biological or ecological context. So I'm going to give, what have we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different terms and their specific definitions in the context of ecosystems. All right, so beginning with the word ecosystem itself. What is an ecosystem? Well, an ecosystem is a community of living organisms in their non-living surroundings. All right, so there's a couple of key things that stick out there, living and non-living. All right. Now, that relates to the next two words, biotic and abiotic. What do those mean? Well, biotic, that is an adjective, a descriptive word, that just simply means living. It really has no other meaning. It's a fancy word for living, okay? So it's an adjective that means living, which is used to describe parts of an ecosystem. Obviously, those parts that are living. So you would not call a rock a biotic part of an ecosystem. Okay, abiotic. Well, often when there's an A in front of a word, that A as a sort of prefix or prefix means that it changes the word to the opposite meaning of the word that would be there if the A wasn't present. Okay, so abiotic is obviously the opposite of biotic. So it's an adjective that means non-living, which is used to describe parts of an ecosystem like, rocks, water, soil, although there would be some microorganisms in soil, and that sort of thing. All right, moving on. Population. Now, a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place at the exact same time. All right. So quite a little bit different to your regular definition of population that you would use in everyday life. So organisms of the same species, same place, same time. So even if you had the exact same species of zebra and you had some in Namibia, let's say, and some in South Africa, we would not call these two groups part of the same population, even though they were the same species. Okay? As it happens, I chose a bad example because they would be different subspecies. I believe there are 7 subspecies of zebra, but you don't need to know that. All right, community. What is a community? Well, a community is an instance of 2 or more populations interacting with each other. So let's go back and remember what a population is. That's when you have organisms of the same species living in the same place at the same time. So a community is when you have an instance of 2 or more populations of different species, okay? So groups of different species interacting with each other. It's the whole, just think Lion King, it's the circle of life, all right? And habitat, that's probably the word that you're most familiar with. That's quite a general term. A habitat is simply the place where a population of organisms live. Okay? Alright, so here we have a big chunk of land, okay? A cross-section, if you will. And we're going to use this big chunk of land to put into context all those concepts that we just defined. So let's begin. Alright, now the entire thing considered as a whole would be regarded as an ecosystem. Why is it regarded as an ecosystem? Well, it satisfies the definition. Let's remember the definition. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms in their non-living surroundings. Okay, that's precisely what we have here. We have living organisms, all sorts of different things. If you look really, really carefully, we've got some kind of mole down here. I think that might be a gembok. I think that's what they're called. We have some hyenas, but don't just think of you know, the animals. We have plants. We have microorganisms in the soil. Okay, and then we have all of the things that aren't even alive: the rocks, the soil itself, the water. Okay, so this entire self-sustaining system in this circle here is an ecosystem. All right, biotic simply means living. That's an easy one. So anything that you see that is living, and many things that you don't see that are living, such as microorganisms in the soil, would be regarded as biotic elements of an ecosystem. Okay, biotic elements of an ecosystem. One thing to note is a single leaf that has fallen from a tree, is that biotic or abiotic? Well, I think that's quite a difficult question to answer because, for example, you can take a cutting from a tree and plant it, and it can, if you do it properly, become another tree. A leaf that's fallen off a tree can also die and just become a crumbly piece of carbon, basically. So that question is a little bit up in the air. But generally speaking, we're talking about, you know, things that are at a particular moment in time very much alive. All right, moving on. Abiotic, or non-living elements. Okay, so as we discussed previously, we have some water over here. These zebras are obviously very thirsty. We have a rock, we have some soil, and there would be all sorts of other non-living elements here that I'm not even thinking of, okay? So those are the abiotic elements of the ecosystem. All right, so what about an example of a population? Well, here we have a population of zebras. Now, in the real world, a population of zebras is not going to just consist of 5 zebras, probably. It's probably going to consist of 100, or a couple of hundred, or a couple of thousand, who knows? Even more perhaps, all right? And don't be fooled into thinking that they all have to be shoulder to shoulder constantly to be in the same place at the exact same time. It's a more general definition than that, okay? Generally speaking, they form a group which congregate, but they might spread themselves over a fairly large range, but that range would be continuous, okay? There would be zebras belonging to that population spread throughout that entire range. So you would consider those zebras a population. You can also have populations of organisms that are, you know, not zebras or giraffes. You might have floral populations, populations of particular flowers or plants, for example. All right. So I don't think it's just restricted to animals and insects and things like that. Okay, here's the circle of life example, a community. Let's take a look at this. What do we have here? So, elephants nourish the grass with their dung, lovely. Wildebeest then eat that grass which is nourished, okay? And if it hadn't been nourished, then the grass wouldn't have enough nutritional value for the wildebeest to survive. So the elephants are integral to the grass, which is integral to the wildebeest, okay? So we have three different species: a species of elephant, a species of wildebeest. I think I called them gemboks before. I think, yeah, that might have been a mistake. There's all sorts of similar looking animals in Africa. So a species of elephant, a species of wildebeest, and a species of grass, all interacting together, forming a community. Okay, so three different populations forming a community. Okay, and finally, the easy one, habitat. Okay, so this big chunk of land here, obviously it would be much larger, is an example of a particular type of habitat, and there are many different types of habitats. Okay, so this particular habitat you might describe as a semi-arid savanna. Okay, arid meaning dry, and semi meaning partly. So you can see that it's quite dry, but not so dry that there's no water whatsoever and no plant life. Okay, so that's an example of a habitat. Now on the internet, you're going to find all sorts of different illustrations showing you the relationship between these different concepts. Okay, so I thought I'd just put a few of those into this. You don't have to memorize this one, that's for sure, but here's a really thorough look at different levels of organization within the living world. Okay, going right down from the level of the atom. Okay, use the mouse here. Here we have an atom. Put atoms together and you get a molecule. When you put molecules together, you can get cells, or cell organelles, which are parts of cells. And then cells are made of cell organelles, cell parts. Tissue in your body is made of cells. Organs are made of tissue, and we follow the same pattern as we go around. We get to organism, which is kind of where we started off at. And then population, group of organisms in the same place at the same time. Okay. And then we go all the way around to the biosphere. Okay, now what is the biosphere? The biosphere is a word used to describe the ecosystem of the entire planet. Okay, if we look back at the definition of an ecosystem, it is a community of living organisms in their non-living surroundings. And the entire planet actually satisfies that definition. An important part of ecosystems is that they're sort of self-contained. That's not entirely true, simply because the sun is separate from the earth, and obviously light is important for photosynthesis, which is important for the growth of plants, and is also obviously important for animals. But generally speaking, we can consider the biosphere, or the ecosystem of the entire planet, to be a self-contained system consisting of both living and non-living parts, or biotic and abiotic parts. Alright, so let's look at biosphere in a little bit more detail. So as I said, it's the totality of all the ecosystems on Earth. So as I said, it's an example of an ecosystem itself. It contains all of Earth's ecosystems. So one ecosystem can actually be composed of several smaller ecosystems. That's something we haven't discussed so far. The biosphere, you might not think about this, but it extends above and below the Earth's surface, because obviously we have things like birds in the sky and we have things like mole rats in the ground. Okay. And the biosphere, a good way to conceptualize it is that the biosphere is the totality of three important parts, okay? And as this final dot point here says, it may be thought of as those parts of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere that contain life. So the next thing we're going to do is define hydrosphere, lithosphere, and atmosphere. And I'd like you to remember these definitions. All right, well, not really definitions, but a pictorial representation of what they are. It's very simple. The atmosphere, you know what that is. That is the totality of all the molecules that surround the planet above ground level, which is the fanciest way possible of saying the air. So we have things like pterodactyls, or I'm not sure if that's a pterodactyl. I'll give the more general term, a pterodon. I don't know why I've chosen all dinosaur examples. Must be my dinosaur bias. The lithosphere is the land, okay? So this dinosaur here, I guess you could say it is standing on the lithosphere, but living in the atmosphere, and it breathes air. So I suppose you would say that this dinosaur here is part of the organisms that live within the atmosphere, but it's heavily reliant upon the lithosphere, obviously, for its habitat. Now, there are organisms within the lithosphere as well, as we discussed. We have all sorts of animals that bury themselves into the soil. We have little teeny microorganisms in the soil, and all sorts of things. And then we have the hydrosphere, which is the totality of all of the water bodies on the planet, whether it's lakes, rivers, or the ocean. Okay? And as you will be well aware, we have all sorts of organisms in the hydrosphere as well. All right, now just because I want to keep you guys engaged, I've just basically at random picked three really interesting features of all ecosystems, okay? And I've put a little video here for you to watch to explain that particular feature. And I'd like you to watch these videos, okay? So I'm not going to talk too much about these three slides. I just want you to watch these videos. So the first interesting feature that I've chosen is the fact that ecosystems are self-sustaining, which we've talked about, okay? And you're going to see a really interesting video about a guy that's created an ecosystem. He's created an ecosystem within a glass bowl that has not been opened for decades. It's incredible. Ecosystems involve incredibly complicated processes, okay? And interactions can be between floral and faunal populations, okay? So plant and animal populations. So it doesn't just have to be, when we're talking about ecosystems, interactions between organisms don't just have to be between plants and plants or between animals and animals. It can all be as mixed up and is as mixed up as you can imagine. Okay. Now for our final slide, we're going to look at features of ecosystems, okay? Now they come in 6 main terrestrial types, which means land types, and 6 main aquatic types, so water-based types. Now the ones on the left are the terrestrial types and the ones on the right are the aquatic types. So we have taiga, we have tundra, we have deciduous forest, grassland, tropical rainforest, and desert. And then in terms of aquatic ecosystems, we have marine, freshwater, lentic, ponds, lotic, and wetlands. And when you're doing an activity based on these, which is something you're going to be doing this week, don't be too stressed out when you discover that there is some significant overlap between some of these different types of ecosystem, okay? That's not a problem at all from the point of view of that activity. But for details on that activity, see the home learning schedule. Thank you for tuning in, guys, and I will talk to you soon.